right, we are taking a break from Joshua. We just started Joshua last week, Joshua chapter 1. We'll be back in Joshua in a couple of weeks. This morning, if you've been here for a little while, for at least a year, this will not be abnormal to you. If you've just gotten here, you're new, and you've been here less than a year, then this will be somewhat abnormal to you, but I'll explain what we're doing. We've got our Father's Day message this morning. Now, why in the world would we have a Father's Day message today? I mean, isn't Father's Day like months away? Does anybody know when Father's Day even is? When is it? Almost next Sunday. That's why we're doing it today. We're doing it next Sunday because I love you so much that what I want to do is give you a week's heads up that next Sunday is Father's Day. And if you've got dad or stepdad at home, whatever, or whatever the situation is, if you've got dad or stepdad at home or away or apart or whatever, you've got a week to think about how you can bless and honor him. It actually is a command in the Bible that we're to honor our father and mother so that our days in this world will be long. But if you don't have a dad or stepdad at home and now you're sour and mad at me because I'm going to be teaching on dads, well, relax. Because if you don't have a dad at home and you're a guy, you're going to learn today what a godly dad, some of the things that a godly dad should be doing. And if you're a young lady and you don't have a dad at home and you're all mad at me, well, relax. Because you're going to learn what kind of a dad you want for your future kids. Because one of these days, you'll have some little kids of your own, and you'll want a good dad to be a blessing to them. And so what are you looking for? I don't know if you ever think about that. I know a lot of times when we're young, man, we're just looking for Lord, would you just please bring me somebody that's really super hot? But what you want to do is be thinking about, Lord, would you bring me somebody that's godly? And, if you want to pray for hotness also, that's okay. But just make sure that you're praying for somebody that's godly. That's the most important thing. And who's going to be a good leader for your family, and so you want to think about those things. So this morning we are looking at, I've got a study from Mark chapter 5 titled The Believing Dad. Let's go back there. Oh, nope, we can go ahead and go there. The Believing Dad, and Mark 5:21 through 43. And as you can see there, I've got the chapter broken up into three parts. I've got the chapter broken up into three parts, and we see that this believing dad. Now, these are three characteristics. They're not the only characteristics in the life of a godly individual. And these are not limited to a dad. Any of us as Christians should be living this way, or at least these should be our goals. But we see these things evident in this dad's life in this section of Scripture, Mark 5:21 through 43. He believes humbly. Okay? When he believes humbly. When he believes patiently. And then thirdly, as we'll see today, when he believes hopefully. What in the world does that mean? That's not something that we're used to hearing, but it is biblical. So we'll get to that as we make our way through this. He believes humbly in Mark 5:21 through 24. This story opens up in verse 21 with this. Now, when Jesus had crossed over again, so this is not the first time he's crossed over, by boat to the other side, a great multitude gathered to him, and he was by the sea. That's obvious. He's by the sea. He's in a boat, and he's crossing over. Now, this is normal for the life of Jesus. He oftentimes would separate himself from the larger crowd for a time to spend time in prayer, seeking his heavenly Father. And then, oftentimes, he would get back in the boat and sail back across and join the crowds once again. And what was often the case is that if people could not follow Jesus to wherever he went, they'd be watching him. And, oh, there he goes. He's going across the sea. We can't get over there. He would spend time in prayer, sometimes through the night. But then when he returned, there would oftentimes be a crowd waiting for him. And so this is one of those times. Jesus arrives back again by boat to the other side. And this great multitude, that phrase indicates for us that there were too many to count. A great multitude gathered to him, and he was by the sea. Okay, so gives us our mind a place, and we go, okay, I can kind of picture him there. Now, beginning in verse 22, we read this. And behold, one of the rulers of the synagogue came, Jairus by name, and when he saw him, he fell at his feet. Now, as is often the case, when you and I are reading through the Bible, we read some of these stories that are strange sometimes, spectacular others, sometimes almost unbelievable, except that it's in the Bible, so I believe it. But oftentimes we'll come to a passage or a verse and read some portion of a story, and we consider it to just, well, it's just normal. It's in the Bible, and crazy things happen, and so it's just a normal occurrence. Well, I want you to take a moment to consider what we just read in verse 22. It says, and behold, one of the rulers of the synagogue came. Now, we do not know if this individual was a priest, was he a Pharisee, what was his official title, but what we do find out is that he was one of the rulers of the synagogue, and that he came to Jesus. Now, that is extraordinary, because for the most part, the religious establishment of the day, in other words, the religious leaders, did not, or I should say, they rejected Jesus. They did not receive him. They did not like him. And you go, well, why would the religious leaders not like Jesus? Well, the religious leaders might not like Jesus at that time. Largely they didn't, because until Jesus came and began to question their authority and really teach the word of God the way that it was supposed to be taught, these individuals, this religious establishment, they had authority, as is often the case even to this day. No doubt there are some of us, we don't have a large crowd here, but no doubt there are some of you here in this room who know that I am a pastor, and that in your mind gives me a little more, a little more authority, a little more weight, that I carry with me. And so some of you, you're thinking like, okay, maybe he's a little more spiritual, or he's whatever. Well, oftentimes religious leaders, they know that people that are coming to their Bible studies, coming to their church, feel that way. And so what happens is they start to kind of like feel like, oh, you know what, maybe I am a little bit higher than all of you. They begin to think loftily about themselves. They become proud. They like authority. It's hard to give up authority once you've received authority, once you've been given or you've gained authority. Once you have it, with that comes some power, comes some notoriety in whatever sphere you're in. And it's hard to just release that. Well, for the religious leaders of that time, Pharisees, some of the Pharisees actually became followers of Jesus. Sadducees never did. They were part of the religious establishment also. There were priests and different people, and there was not a large group of religious leaders that followed Jesus. It might have been because Jesus called them whitewashed tombs with dead men's bones inside of them. I don't know, it could have been something like that. But as Jesus questioned their authority and their power, they began to reject Jesus more and more. And so the fact that this ruler, a ruler of the synagogue, comes to Jesus, this is where the thought comes, the idea comes, that he believes humbly. This man of authority comes to Jesus. This is irregular. It is abnormal. No doubt, I'm guessing at least, he must have received some resistance from his fellow religious leaders. But he comes to Jesus humbly. Now, how do we know that? Well, number one, because he disregards his position. We see that in verse 22. But let me share something with you here. He humbles himself, verse 22, and behold, one of the rulers of the synagogue came. He's one of the rulers of the synagogue. But he humbles himself, and how does he do that? By disregarding his position. In other words, the position that he has of authority, he disregards that. This is what I was going to share with you here in 2 Samuel 22:28, and then we'll get back to our notes in just a minute. But here's what God said through the prophet Samuel: you will save the humble people. I guess this is what the prophet was saying about God. But you will save the humble people. But your eyes are on the haughty, not that kind of a haughty. This is Haughty, not H-O-T-T-Y. But your eyes are on the haughty. That means the prideful. Your eyes are on the prideful. Why? That you may bring them down. Did you know that the Bible actually tells us to be humble? We're supposed to humble ourselves. We're not supposed to wait for God to humble us. We're supposed to humble ourselves. In our attitude, spiritually speaking, even in our bodily position, that's biblical also. We'll see that here with this man. But the biblical principle is that God exalts the humble, but he lowers those that are proud. We go back to our notes where we see that he humbled himself. Again, he disregarded his position in verse 22. He had this position of authority, being one of the rulers of the synagogue. But he disregards that. Now, what would cause this man to so easily disregard his position? We'll get to that in just a moment. But it says, here's the next thing, and behold, one of the rulers of the synagogue came. Doesn't seem like a big deal, but the fact that he came to Jesus or goes to Jesus is another indication that he's humbling himself. Now, why did he go there? Again, we'll get to that in just a moment. But the fact that he even bothered to come to Jesus, that's a step of faith. It's a step of belief. And it's a step made in humility. Now, humility is when we lower ourselves. I think most of us know that. If you don't, you do now. But he goes to Jesus. I love this here. Verse 23, he prays. Look at this. And begged him earnestly, saying, my little daughter lies at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, that she may be healed, and she will live. So all of a sudden we realize why this man was coming to Jesus in the first place. Why was he willing to disregard his position? Why was he willing to go to Jesus when the rest of his fellow religious leaders were not? Well, we find out that it is because he has a daughter that is on the brink of death. She's at death's doorstep. And he is desperately seeking help for her. And so what does he do? He prays. Now, it may not have seemed like he prayed, because you go, well, what do you mean he prayed? He didn't kneel down, fold his hands, close his eyes, bow his head, and say, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. So what do you mean he's praying? No, this is a prayer. It's a prayer request. When he says to Jesus, my little daughter lies at the point of death, come and lay your hands on her. That's his request. And you'll notice in verse 23 that he begged him. He begged him. These are all signs of humility. In Philippians chapter 2, Paul wrote in verses 5, 6, and 7, he said, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. So have the same mindset. Who being in the form of God did not consider it robbery to be equal with God. In other words, Jesus was and is, but he was equal with God. He was in heaven, equal with God. And it says in verse 7, though he had that position of authority, in verse 7 of Philippians chapter 2, he made himself of no reputation. In other words, Jesus humbled himself, made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant and coming in the likeness of men. So Jesus did the same thing, or maybe I should say this man did the same thing that Jesus did. He humbled himself. He came. He made himself a bondservant, bowed himself there, as we saw there in verse 22, that when he saw him, he fell at his feet. It's not something that we would normally want to do. I mean, I want you to think about it. When was the last time someone bested you? Meaning they beat you. Those of you that are gamers. Somebody destroyed you. Would you ever think to bow down at their feet and say, you are superior to me? You would never do that. Maybe if you lost a bet, but you would never do that of your own volition. You would never bow yourself to anybody. In fact, think about it. When was the last time you bowed your knee to anyone? I mean, have you ever fallen at somebody's feet and said, you're superior to me? No way. You know why? Because we're American. do that, man. We don't bow to nobody, especially the British, but we don't bow to nobody, right? We don't even drink tea, man. We drink coffee, right? Throw that stuff in the river. But we don't do that because the mindset is what? Ain't no way I'm going to bow myself to anybody. I'm nobody's slave. I'm nobody's servant. No way. Even if somebody just absolutely destroyed you at a game, at wherever it might be, you would never bow down to them. And yet this man, being so very desperate, comes and bows down. And then he begs him earnestly. And here's what he says in verse 23. My little daughter lies at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, that she may be healed and she will live. In this same account, in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 8, verse 42, it tells us, for he had an only daughter about 12 years of age, and she was dying. But as he went, the multitudes thronged him. We're told there in Luke's account that she was about 12 years old, and it was his only daughter. It's his only daughter. Now, that doesn't make it any more intense. I mean, he could have had 5 daughters. He still would have been worried about the one. But the fact that he only had one, that was it. That was his only offspring. Whether he was going to have more or not, we do not know. At that point, he had a daughter, 12 years old, and he's desperately seeking help in the rescue of her life. And because he is so desperate, he is willing to humbly come to Jesus, and he believes that Jesus can do something about it. Now, we'll find out as we get down toward the end of the story, the account, that he's got a wife who's the mother of his daughter. She's not in this story, not until the end. Why is that? Probably because she stayed back with her daughter. And can you imagine the parents? So very desperate. Their daughter on the brink of death. And then the dad in that moment says, I'll be back. I'm going to get help. I'm going to get Jesus. I believe that he can do something. And the dad sets off. I mean, that would be terrifying. I imagine for his wife, that would be terrifying. Like, wait, our daughter could die at any moment. She's right there on the edge, and you're taking off? But his desperation was pushing him from behind, and hope was pulling him from ahead. And so he takes off to go find Jesus. In verse 24, we read this, so Jesus went with him, and a great multitude followed him and thronged him. This is wonderful. In verse 23, what did he do? He prayed. In verse 24, Jesus begins to answer. He begins to answer, verse 24. So Jesus went with him. So he answered his prayer. In the affirmative, he goes, okay, I'll come with you. Now, what did the man, don't forget, what did the man ask? My little daughter lies at the point of death. She's about to die. Come, look what he says. Come and lay your hands on her, that she may be healed, and she will live. Do not forget that, because this dad didn't. He did not forget this. He heard, or he knew about Jesus, and Jesus hears him, and what does Jesus do in verse 24? So Jesus went with him. Implying on the part of Jesus that Jesus is going to answer his prayer, that Jesus wants to do what he's asking. Jesus went with him. Jesus didn't say, can't come right now. The crowds are thronging, and I love the sound of my name in my ears. He didn't say, man, they're all thronging, and you know what? I've got autographs to sign, and I've got, kids to pat on the head, and, babies to kiss, and, sorry, I can't go right now. All these people are worshiping me. Can't make it. When he hears the man's request, his prayer, he says, okay, I'm coming with you. Jesus went with him. So obviously, Jesus intends to completely answer this man's prayer. Jesus went with him. And look at this at verse 24. And a great multitude followed him and thronged him. Great multitude means that there were too many to count. They're following him. And they hear what this man asks. And Jesus goes, okay, I'll come with you. And everybody's like, oh, we got to go see. right? The crowds. We talked about it before, mall mentality, right? Whatever's happening, you see, you're driving down the freeway, man, you've been with your parents. It's like, okay, it's super slow, you're going 5 miles an hour. Like, man, I wonder what's going on up there. And then you finally get up there like 8 miles later. Oh, man, there's flashing lights. But everybody had to stop to look. Oh, look at that. Somebody's car is broken down, right? I've never seen that before in California. Everybody's got to stop and look, right? Don't let there be a wreck on the other side of the freeway, because everybody on our side has to slow down and look. What's going on over there? I don't understand. I do not understand. Who would want to look over there and see a dead body or somebody bleeding to death? Who wants to do that? I don't understand that. But everybody follows Jesus. But Jesus fully intends to go answer this man's request. Look what this says in 2 Chronicles 7:14. This slide right here, you need to know this. This is how much I love you. The first service, they didn't get this slide. Okay? You can thank me later. 2 Chronicles 7:14 says this. Here's a biblical principle. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves like this dad did, and pray like this dad did, and seek my face like this dad did, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven. What did Jesus do? He heard, and will forgive their sin and heal their land. This is a biblical principle here, that when we humble ourselves and we pray and request something from God, that he's going to hear us, that he's going to answer. We move on to our second main division, which is he believes patiently in verses 25 through 34. I love this section. Verse 25. Now, a certain woman had a flow of blood for 12 years. It means that she had been bleeding from her body for 12 years and had suffered many things from many physicians. She had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, if only I may touch his clothes, I shall be made well. So this woman actually had faith. She didn't want to bother Jesus and say, Jesus, can you stop? Could you pray? She probably, I imagine, that she did not want to attract that much attention for such a sensitive subject. She didn't want to stop Jesus in front of everybody and, can you imagine? I've been bleeding for 12 years. Can you do something about it? No, who wants to do that? No woman would want to do that. And so she decides in her own mind, her faith is acting out. And she says, if I believe that if I don't need to bother Jesus, I just believe that he has so much power that if I just touch his garments, the clothes that he's wearing, I'll be healed, she thought. So she evidently had heard or had seen Jesus and decided in her mind that this man is powerful, and he's so powerful, I don't need him to do anything other than I just need to touch his clothes. So she decides that. And in verse 29, the story continues. Immediately, the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of the affliction instantaneously, miraculously. Now, those are the kinds of works of God that I like. Like if I ask for something, I'd like to can't just do it right now, God? But we're learning about a dad who believes patiently. You might be thinking right now, wait a minute, what about the dad? We're not talking about him right now. And it says in verse 30, and Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that power had gone out of him, turned around in the crowd and said, who touched my clothes? Crazy. There's hundreds, maybe thousands, I don't know. But there are people thronging Jesus. Now, you remember, it's already told us twice that there was a great multitude following Jesus. So there's a huge crowd. We don't know how many. There were too many to count. Thronging, what does that mean? It means that they were all crowded around him, pressing in on him. If you've ever been someplace that's, super crowded, everybody's pushing up against you, been to an amusement park, and you're waiting in line to get on your favorite roller coaster, there's always somebody behind you, man, that's always like on your heels, stepping on you, bumping into you. And you're just like, man, what is the deal? Quit touching me, right? Because we're Californians, right? We don't want anybody, don't quit touching me, man. Personal space. But there are a lot of people who don't know about personal space, right? And it's like, oh, man. And so Jesus is walking with his disciples. Everybody's thronging. It means everybody's crowded around him. And then this woman reaches out, maybe through the crowd, I don't know, through the crowd, touches his clothing. She's immediately healed. And then Jesus stops and says, who touched me? Now, we're all thinking, what a silly question. Everybody's touching you. And that's evidently what one of his disciples thought, because look at this in verse 31. But his disciples said to him, you see the multitude thronging you and you say, who touched me? They're like trying to rebuke Jesus, like, Jesus, seriously? You see everybody touching you, and then you're asking who's touching you? And he looked around to see her who had done this thing. I like that he just totally ignores his disciples. His disciples are like, really? Everybody's crowding around you, and you're asking who's touching you? And then he's like, whatever. And he turns around and looks and finds this woman. It says that he looked around to see her who had done this thing. But the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. Now, why is she fearing and trembling? Well, probably because she's been caught. Jesus knows it. She's like, oh, Jesus knows I touched his clothes. But also, my assumption, I may be completely wrong on this, but my assumption is that this woman is probably like a lot of people, like a lot of us. She didn't want any attention, especially for this sensitive matter. And Jesus turns around, says, who touched me? And then looks at this woman. And now all of a sudden, not just Jesus, but everybody's looking at this woman. Now all eyes are on her. And what happens here in verse 34? Well, she told him all the entire truth in verse 33. And in verse 34 it says, and he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. You mean it wasn't his magical clothing? Because some people think that. Some people actually think that, oh, he had like magical, mystical clothing or something. And, if you could just, get your hands on the clothing of Jesus, it'll do something, something miraculous. You ever heard of the Shroud of Turin? It's a piece of cloth that is believed by some to have been his burial cloth, Jesus' burial cloth that it laid on his face to cover his face, and then that it's got like this, you see it, and it's got like this image of a man on there with a beard and long hair. You can kind of see it. Well, some people like, oh, the Shroud of Turin, man, that's magical or powerful, and if we could just get that, then we can just, wave it at people or slap them or whatever, and just whatever. It's the craziest thing. On TV, you can find preachers that will, if you will send them enough money, they will send you a prayer cloth. Something that they prayed with and, wiped their sweaty head with or something, and they'll put it in the mail and they'll send it to you for enough money. And then that cloth will perform miracles for you. People actually think this. That's not what Jesus is saying here. He didn't say, oh, it was my clothing. This cloak is special, as she touched him. He says, it was your faith that made you well. Her faith in what? Her faith in the fact that Jesus was powerful enough that she didn't even need to touch him, that she could just touch his clothing. That was what her faith was in. It was in Jesus, not in his clothing. It was in Jesus. And then he says to her, go in peace and be healed of your affliction. Now, let me ask you a question. Where's the dad? You see, we started reading in verse 25, went all the way down to verse 34. We didn't read anything about the dad. What happened to him? Where'd he go? Where's he at? Well, we're going to find out in a minute. He's still there. But what it indicates to us, we have no record of this dad saying anything. He said nothing. And that is because he was still believing Jesus patiently. He understood that Jesus was in the midst of performing a miracle, ministering to somebody. And he's, as far as we can tell, we have no record of his complaining, like, Jesus, I mean, had it been me, maybe had it been your dad trying to bring Jesus to you, he might have been like, hey, lady, later, okay, we got to go. He might have been like, no, Jesus, grabbing Jesus, and like, I might have grabbed Jesus and been like, no, she's fine, she's healed, let's go. Nobody has time for that. But the fact that there's no response for him, no complaining, no chasing the woman away, no rebuking Jesus, he just patiently believes that though Jesus is not answering his prayer request immediately, that Jesus is on his way to do it. Did you notice that? That this man has a daughter that's at the point of death. This woman that we just read about is not at the point of death. She's bleeding, she's sick, but she's not at the point of death. She's still walking around. This man's daughter is at the point, she's on her deathbed. And by the time they get to his house, she will be dead. This woman, who would you say is in more desperate need? The young girl or the woman? We would say the girl. She's at the point of death. This woman is, yes, she's sick, but she's still alive. And yet Jesus chooses to immediately minister to this woman. But he hinders his answer to prayer for this dad, Jairus, and for the little girl. Now, do you sometimes feel like, man, we got an issue in our family, and and what's up with dad? Like, where's he at? Why is he, why is he not just fixing it? Why isn't he just jumping in there and just, getting it done? Maybe your dad is believing patiently. Maybe he's already taken that issue to the Lord, and he's trusting the Lord and saying, nah, God's going to take care of it. I don't need to get in there in the mix and mess it up. That's what we do so often. Like, we pray and we just pray like crazy, and then we're like, oh, God, you're taking too long. I'll just go ahead and do it. And then we want to jump in there and answer our own prayer. And do you sometimes find that your dad is like, man, what's the deal? Well, maybe your dad has already committed it to the Lord, and he's just waiting on, he knows, he's believing patiently. No, God's going to work. We just got to be patient. Let him work. Let me say something to you. Ministry. What is ministry? Ministry is when we serve the Lord by serving other people. That's ministry. I've been in ministry for a lot of years now. Almost 30 years. Let me share something with you in case you are thinking about going into the ministry, or maybe you're feeling God start to kind of pull your heart like to go and serve in the ministry. Ministry will always be inconvenient if you are building your own kingdom. Ministry will always be inconvenient if you are working on your own timeline. If you are in ministry and you are, what you're supposed to be doing is working on God's timeline, if you are working according to God's timeline, then it will never be inconvenient. It's always going to happen right on time. God is faithful. He's got a timeline that he's working on. It's not my timeline, it's his timeline. So when I find myself in ministry, and again, I've been in ministry for a lot of years, I've found myself impatient so many times. Like, let's go, God, I need an answer right now. Fix this problem. And God is just like taking his sweet time. And I'm thinking, like, God, don't you see our issue here? We need some help. But that's because in those moments, I'm operating on my own timeline. I think that it has, something to do with me, like it's centered on me, like ministry is focused on me. It's not. It's on God's time. And if I will keep that in mind as I serve the Lord, then nothing is ever inconvenient. Apparent distractions, apparent side roads and shortcuts and things that seem to take up time, they're no longer inconvenient because now I know, hey, I'm working on God's timeline. If he wants to stop and minister and do these other things, let him do it. This dad understands that. He believes patiently. Is that your dad? If you got a dad like that, that's a wonderful attribute. He's not impatient, praying for God to do something and then trying to answer his own prayer. You don't want that. You want him to just wait patiently for the Lord. In 1 Timothy chapter 6, Paul said this to Timothy, but you, O man of God, and I don't think I'm being too daring by saying you, O man or woman of God, if you just want to follow God, you want to be godly, flee these things. What is he talking about? He's talking about sins that he mentioned before. But here's what he says, and pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love. Those all sound great, but then he messes it up by putting patience in there, right? Who wants to be patient? I don't want to be patient. But that is a godly attribute. And then he mentions gentleness also. So patience is something, among other things, that I ought to be pursuing if I want to be godly. I got to be patient. I got to wait on God's timing. I've got a couple of other verses to share that I won't put on the screen because they're larger portions, but I will list them here in case you want to write them down and look at them later. I'll read some short portions from both of these. In James chapter 1, verses 2 through 8, James wrote this, my brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. Let patience have its perfect work. What? James goes on to say, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally. Did you know that God did things liberally? He gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith, no doubting. For he who doubts is like a wave of the sea driven and tossed by the wind. For let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. We don't want that. We want a dad who's like, good leadership and just he's steady and he believes the Lord. He says, let's just wait. The Lord's going to answer. We want that. In John chapter 11, it's a large portion. Again, I won't read it all, but this is the account of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. Another miracle. Jesus finds out that Lazarus is sick and dying. And then it says this in John chapter 11, verse 6. So when he heard that he was sick, when he heard Lazarus was sick, he stayed 2 more days in the place where he was. What? Jesus hears that Lazarus is sick and dying, so he decides he's going to stay right where he's at for 2 more days. He doesn't go. Why? Further on in verse 17 of John chapter 11, it says, so when Jesus came, he found that he had already been in the tomb, that's Lazarus, for 4 days. By the time he gets there, Lazarus has already been dead 4 days. Goes on to say, as he's approaching the family, it was Lazarus and his 2 sisters, Martha and Mary, he first encounters Martha. It says, now Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. That's a true statement. That's a true statement. Had you been here, my brother would not have died. Do you think Jesus doesn't know that? Jesus knows that. Jesus knows that had he shown up, he could have healed Lazarus of the sickness and kept him alive. Now for you and I, that's the most important thing. Friday, I found myself at the hospital. I got a call from a good friend that some of you know, actually. Hey, my daughter's in the hospital. Could you come pray? That's always our main prayer. God, would you heal this individual completely right now? That's what we want. We consider that to be the best possible outcome. That if they've got some disease or they're sick and dying, Lord, heal them. But you see, Jesus, and that's what Martha was thinking, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. True statement. He then encounters the other sister, Mary. Imagine 2 sisters, man. Verse 32. Then Mary came where Jesus was and saw him. She fell down at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, same thing, my brother would not have died. True statement. It is true. Because in our minds, the best possible outcome is that our loved one would be healed of the sickness and not die. But Jesus was going to do something a little bit better than that. The crowd says in John chapter 11, some of them said, could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind also have kept this man from dying? Everybody knows it. Martha knows it. Mary knows it. The crowd knows it. Everybody knows. If Jesus had been here, he could have, this would have worked out perfectly. He could have healed Lazarus of the sickness and kept him alive. Jesus says to Martha in John chapter 11, did I not say to you that if you would believe, what are we talking about? Belief. If you would believe, you would see the glory of God. The story goes on. Jesus goes to the tomb where Lazarus is, and he said, Lazarus, come out, in a loud voice. Lazarus. He yelled at him. He had to yell at him because he was dead already 4 days. He goes like, Lazarus, come out. Verse 44, and he who had died came out, bound hand and foot with grave clothes. In other words, they had mummified him already, so he was walking out like, oh, I'm in these grave clothes. And it says, and his face was wrapped with a cloth, and Jesus said to them, loose him and let him go. Which was better? Which was more of a miracle? Healing Lazarus of a sickness and keeping him alive, or allowing him to be dead? Not an hour, not a day, not 2 days, not 3 days, 4 days, and then raising him from the dead. We can all agree, no, that's probably a bigger miracle. That's a bigger deal. So we may think that we know the best possible outcome. However, the Lord knows. And a good dad is going to believe patiently. Hey, let the Lord work. There's hope. Don't give up yet. The third thing that we see in this passage, beginning at verse 35 down to verse 43, is that he believes hopefully. Now that's weird because for most of us we go, oh man, hopefully my team will win. I was hoping that my team would win yesterday, and we got beat 5-1. It was horrific. What does it mean to believe hopefully? Well, in verses 35 through 40, we see that he renews his belief. Verse 35, while he was still speaking, some came from the ruler of the synagogue's house. And here's what they said: your daughter is dead. Why bother or why trouble the teacher any further? See, that's where we go. No more hope. She's dead. Don't bother the Lord anymore. Just stop praying. Right? You ever heard that? Like, it's too late. No need to pray anymore. Just let it go. God lost this one. Everybody takes an L sometimes. And, God lost, so just let it go. Not this dad. No way. Verse 36, as soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken. Now remember, they're still standing in the crowd. The woman with the issue of blood has just been healed. The dad's waiting for Jesus to finish. He hears what the people say, that his daughter is dead. And here's what Jesus says in verse 36. Do not be afraid, only believe. Only believe. Remember that if we would believe, we'll see the glory of God. In verse 37 it says, and he permitted no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. So he takes just those 3 disciples. Then he came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue. I love this. He sees a tumult and those who wept and wailed loudly. In other words, the little girl had died, and they had to bury individuals who died. They had to be buried same day. So they've already got a band there. They've already got people that are mourning and wailing and, oh, she's dead. And they would have been extremely loud, and it would have been it would have been raucous, man. It would have been like just a huge ordeal. And I love this in verse 39. When he came in, that's Jesus, he came in, he said to them, why make this commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping. Now see, we think, Jesus, oh, dude, read the room. Like, the girl's dead. She's in the room. She's dead. Everybody knows it. You just got here, man. You didn't know she was dead. It's time to give it up. And so what does it say? In verse 40, and they ridiculed him when he said that. I love this. There are lots of funny things, at least things that I think are funny in the Bible. You may not think so, but I think that this is one of the funniest. Because it says in verse 40, they ridiculed him, but when he had put them all outside. In other words, Jesus gets there, he's a little bit late, gets there. People are, they're mourning this little girl's death, and they're screaming and yelling and playing music and whatever else, and funerals started, and then he comes in and he goes, hey, why are you guys making all this noise? She's not dead, she's just asleep. And then they all stop and start laughing at him. You're out of your mind. And then he goes, get out. kicks everybody out. It's not even his house. He's kicking people out. This man is wild. Wild. And he kicks everybody out. And then he took the father and the mother of the child, whose belief has been renewed. What did the man say to the dad? Hey, believe. Don't stop. Don't stop believing like Journey, right? Don't stop believing. Just, you believe and you're going to see the glory of God. But I want you to consider this also. As far as we can tell, the mom was not with the dad when he first went to Jesus. My assumption is she stayed at home with her daughter. And the dad, her husband's like, hey, I'll be back. I'm going to get help. Here he goes again. No, I'm going to go get Jesus. You're going to get Jesus. You're going to bring Jesus to our house. Okay. And then he actually comes in the door with Jesus. And I wonder what went on in the heart and in the mind of this woman. I think that her faith was renewed because she doesn't stop Jesus. It says here in verse 40 that he took the 3 disciples, he took the father and mother of the child and those who were with him, and they entered where the child was lying. So this mom and dad, they're still at this point like, okay, I guess he's going to do something. And they follow Jesus into the room. They didn't say, no, she's already dead, leave her alone. Stop, give it up. But they actually follow Jesus into the room. In Romans chapter 4, verse 18, let me read something to you here. Talking about Abraham, Paul said, who, contrary to hope, so against hope, in hope believed. Now, that doesn't mean that he believed in hope like, okay, I'm going to place my faith in hope. That's not what it says. It means that he believed and was hopeful. He was hopeful. He was believing hopefully. Thus, the title of this section. He was believing with hope. He says, contrary to hope, in hope believed, so that he became the father of many nations, according to what was spoken, so shall your descendants be, he says. But do you understand? Why did his faith continue? Why did his hope, his belief continue? Because it was based on what had been spoken. God said something to him, and Abraham believed it. This man here, Jesus said to him, do not be afraid, only believe. And the man said, okay, I'll believe you. And he continued following Jesus, went into the room. And it says in verse 41 through 43 that not only was his faith or his belief renewed, but he receives his reward. In verse 41, then he took the child by the hand and said to her, Talitha Kumi, which is translated, little girl, I say to you, arise. I mean, imagine. It's not an odd thing to touch somebody who's dead. You know, if you and I go to a funeral, it's not a strange thing to, you know, if it's an open casket, to reach in and just kind of squeeze the hand or, you know, just touch the shoulder or something. That's not really a weird thing. But Jesus, again, walks up and then he grabs her by the hand and just starts pulling this poor little girl up who's dead. But in the process of pulling her up, he says, Talitha Kumi. Little girl, I say to you, get up. And as that happens, there's verse 42, immediately the girl arose and walked, for she was 12 years of age. And they were overcome with great amazement. Of course they were. But he commanded them strictly that no one should know it, and said that something should be given her to eat. If you've got a dad like that believes hopefully, that's like, hey, beyond hope. He just keeps hoping. He just keeps hoping, and he keeps praying, trusting the Lord, and you're just like, Dad, give it up, man, it's too late. You want to be thankful for that kind of a dad. It's a good quality. It's a good quality for any of us as Christians, but it's a good quality for a dad, that he would never give up. I mean, imagine. You might get, you know, you look at your dad like, Dad, come on, give it up, man, it's over. But is that what you want him to do with you? When you're struggling, falling, and things aren't going well in your life, you want your dad to just go, lost cause, too late, loser. No, what you want is for your dad to keep believing, man. Keep pushing in faith. To never give up. Keep asking the Lord, Lord, help my son, help my daughter. That's what you want. That's what we all want. That's what we all want. We want our dad to not give up. My dad gave up. I I got saved. My dad's no longer around. As far as I know, he's still alive, but I haven't seen him in, I don't know how this, 20 years or so. I don't know. Probably longer than that. He gave up. But thank God I've got a heavenly Father who didn't give up. That's what we want. We want a dad that just, man, he just always believing, man. He just doesn't stop. And we'll see his faith rewarded. Father, thank you so much for your word.